to the Master Debater Room. Today here we're having a debate between me, I'm Jacob, and Footsoldier. Footsoldier has put forward the proposition. Let me just get it absolutely. He believes that certain distinctions within philosophy break down, particularly the analytic synthetic distinction, the a priori, a posteriori distinction, and the necessary contingent distinction. I will be taking the opposition here, attempting to save at least something of these distinctions, saying that they're still somewhat important. So, yeah, without further ado, I don't know, Footsoldier, would you like to begin with your sort of attack, or would you like me to sort of lay out my idea of what these distinctions are?
Sure. Maybe we can, before going into the attack, for anyone who's watching who isn't familiar with the distinctions, we should start off by defining them. So, if you'd like to define them, you can. Otherwise, I can.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give it a shot, and then if we disagree, we can hash it out.
Right.
So, I think basically, I think one of the most important distinctions here that we're going to be doing today is the sneezing distinction. Excuse. Okay,
Nice.
what a way to start. So the analytic synthetic distinction. We can say that there are sort of intuitively, we can come to a realization that these are two different types of statements that we can make: the analytic statement, the synthetic statement. So we can say that a statement such as, my wife has 7 toes. Okay, that's the first statement. Second statement, bachelors are unmarried men. That is the second statement. So the first statement about my wife having 7 toes would depend upon outside information to confirm it. In order to know if that statement is correct or not, you would have to meet my wife, ask her to take off her shoes, look at her feet, and you could confirm or deny that she has 7 toes. Okay. The second statement, the idea that a bachelor is an unmarried man, requires no such acts outside of the statement itself to confirm or disconfirm. We can see that by the very meaning of the word bachelor in the language that we're using, bachelors are unmarried men. We don't need anything outside of the word bachelor, concept bachelor, and the language in which bachelor has meaning to come to that conclusion. So that, I think, is the first sort of major distinction on the table, this idea between an analytic statement and a synthetic statement.
I think that's great for now. I think we can get into the other distinctions later, but the analytic synthetic is definitely a great starting place to define what we mean, because the other ones are sort of similar, and we can get into them if we like to do that later. I would say, yeah, you've defined it in a really nice way. That's what I agree with in terms of the meaning. And as you already said, it does feel intuitive. It feels intuitive that if your wife has 7 toes, you sort of need to look at the toes and find out if that's the case. But if we just define something as being synonymous with something else, saying, yeah, bachelors are married men, then we don't need to go and look in the world. So it seems like there's 2 different types of statement being offered here, 2 different types of proposition. And we sort them. One is analytic and one is synthetic. The problem is when we come to actually try and define what analytic actually means, we run into some problems, right? So Quine, in his work, The Two Dogmas of Empiricism, and this is the main body of work which I'm going to be drawing from in my attack on the analytic synthetic distinction. He says, to quote him, that the analytic synthetic distinction is a metaphysical article of faith with no clear boundary. Right. So what he means by this is we can't really define it in any satisfactory way without it being somehow self-referential, without it referencing itself And if something is defined by referencing itself, then we're just going to define something in a circular way. So if I just say to you, blah, blah, and you're like, what does that mean? And I'm like, oh, you don't know what blah, blah, blah means? Oh, well, blah, blah, blah means blah, blah, blah. And you're just going to be like, well, you haven't told me anything about anything. I'm none the wiser now that you've explained that. You've just repeated it. And so if we define something purely circularly, then it doesn't seem to offer any explanatory power, and it doesn't actually seem to offer any understanding in addition to what we've already got on the table when we just put out the word blah, blah, blah. Or like if you don't know what
Sure. I have a few things to say sort of in response to this. So
okay, cool.
on the one hand, all of language can only work by supplying definitions to words that are also in language, right? There's never a case where you explain a term without using other terms, which themselves have to be explained. So this kind of this quibble about the analytic is true of really any attempt at definition at all, in any sense, synthetic terms included. Secondly, I guess, is that simply knowing that bachelors are unmarried men, I could then make sense of a bunch of, let's say, empirical studies on the nature of bachelors. Let's say I read a bunch of empirical studies. Bachelors are very lazy. They never keep anything in the refrigerator, etc. That 17% of them anyway across multivariate analysis, whatever. I couldn't make sense of that study if I didn't know what bachelor meant. But with the analytic statement, bachelors are unmarried men, then that study is suddenly apparent to me. So that might not seem, most people know this, but the idea of words being synonymous with one another is going to open up a whole possibility of meaning, right? Where you're able to connect bodies of knowledge about bachelors with a whole body of knowledge about unmarried men and see that, oh, these are actually, a synonymous body of knowledge.
Okay, cool. Well, I've got approximately like in a way 6 objections to the way we can try to define what analyticity is. And it feels like you've invoked 2 of them just there. So you had 2 different examples. You had sort of like our language, we sort of need to start somewhere because everything is just referencing something else in our language, and we're just going to have a problem with definitions um, in general. Um, and so we just sort of need to say, okay, well, there's certain things which just appear to be analytic and certain things which don't appear to be analytic. So we're just going to go off our intuition and call them analytic. Um, and maybe we've formed a big list of things that we're going to put in this category of analytic and a big list of things that we're going to put in synthetic, right? So we don't really have a clear rule for it because we've got a problem with definition in general. Maybe we don't have a rule for what is analytic and what is synthetic, and it's just going to be a general problem. So what we're just going to do is like just say, oh, well, these things just sort of seem to mean what it is that we're referring to by analytics. So just bundle them all into a list, and all of the rest of it let's slap into a list of synthetic. The problem if with having a long list is once you start to ask, well, why is that word in the list? Or you're trying to say, no, that word shouldn't be in the list. Then by what standard do you judge whether it should be in the list or not? Because then
Right. So
you
that's
then
a good
need to
question.
define it.
Can you think of an example of a word or an analytic statement that you think is not a true analytic statement or doesn't fit in the list of analytic statements?
Or we can just take anything, whether it's a bachelor is an unmarried man or triangles have 3 sides, or something like this.
Okay,
We
so
can
what is it about a bachelor being an unmarried man that you don't that you have a problem with. Like, why is that not true? It's true.
Or I don't know, is it analytic? Like, what if I want to say, oh, well, I'm not sure if it's analytic or not. Where's the rule to see whether it's analytic or not, whether it should be in that list or not?
Well, you say that is the statement able to be made by the definitions of the words in the language that it's made in? Assuming language L, if you want to get sort of specific here, assuming a given language, does this word in that language, does that word contain the concepts elaborated by the analytic statement? So I guess here is a good example. If I were to say that cats are animals, right? There are philosophers, not ones I would necessarily defend, that would say that's an analytic statement because the idea cat contains the idea animal, right? And there is a kind of empirical attack you can make against such a statement to say that if we were to discover through empirical investigation that all cats were in fact robots, then we would actually have to revise this analytic statement according to our experiences. It would no longer be a priori analytic. Oh no. But I would say that such a statement is really about multi-definitions, the definition of animal, the definition of cat, and how they fit together. It's a synthetic statement in disguise. That a true analytic statement would be one like a bachelor is an unmarried man, where if through empirical investigation I were to discover that the bachelor in question was in fact married, right? I would instead just say, oh, he's not a bachelor, right?
Yeah, yeah,
It's
sure.
not like the empirical investigation would cause me to reevaluate my whole definition and the category that I put bachelors in. I am instead simply would just say, oh, he's not a bachelor, because what it means to be bachelor in terms of the language, a given language, L, or the English language in this game we're playing, is that it's an unmarried man. And so, given that this language means that by this, all of that given, we can then go on to say, bachelors are unmarried men. We can make all sorts of analytic statements given a language that means whatever it means.
Right. So I agree with all of that. I agree that if you had a definition of bachelor and then you found out that someone wasn't a bachelor, didn't fit that definition, then sure, then that person just simply isn't a bachelor. You don't have to change the definition. But even the statement, bachelors are unmarried men, there's some difficulties there. So you're saying it's analytic now because it's synonymous. And generally, people accept that the synonymity of two words in relation of a proposition like bachelors are unmarried men is what we are defining as the analytic element.
Right.
Or the
It is, although it's not just its synonymous nature, right? Like I could say that bachelors are unmarried and just leave it at that, right? The concept unmarried is also contained within the word bachelor, and so I don't need to. Unmarried and bachelor are not the same because you could be an unmarried
yeah.
woman, right? So I can get these concepts out of bachelor that are contained within it that don't need to be strictly synonymous, but clearly I'm not just pulling them out of nowhere. They exist within the concept bachelor in our given language.
Right, but it's not an analytically true statement that a bachelor is an unmarried woman, or that a bachelor is an unmarried person, or that a bachelor is a man, or any of these things,
So,
right? It's
so
only
the first two were not analytic statements, but the third one, that a bachelor is an unmarried man, I think I heard, would be, because a bachelor is an unmarried man.
I just meant a bachelor is a man, for example. Like that wouldn't obtain it wouldn't be true either, right?
Well,
If
bachelors
you're
are
just saying it's
men.
a man and not unmarried.
Well, bachelors are men. I could say a bachelor is a man.
Yeah, but if he's a married man, then he's no longer a bachelor.
Right, but I could say that all men or sorry, all bachelors are men.
Yeah, you can say all bachelors are men,
I would
right?
not say that all men are bachelors. That would be wrong. But I could say that all bachelors are men.
Right. So what we're going to do here then is say, look, all bachelors are men. So what is a bachelor? Is an unmarried man, and all unmarried men are bachelors. So we're saying then we can just replace that with all men are men, or all unmarried men are unmarried men, or all bachelors are bachelors, right? And then we're just saying A is A, and then that's circularly defined. We haven't got any sense of synonymity there. We've just defined it in a circle.
So I agree that there is a question as to whether such a definition of analyticity can be useful, because for Frege, who had a much larger definition of analyticity that Quine was attacking, he found that notion incredibly useful. So Quine's notion that is narrower, he's like, oh, it's less useful, you can't do as much with it. Okay, I would accept that. But certainly we did show that synonyms are valuable, right? They would open up and combine two different domains of knowledge, right, that were unconnected before without the relationship of these two things mean the same thing. And tautologies, in case of A equals A, although you could say, okay, what does that give me? Okay, not filled with stuff, are all true, right? A tautology is trivially true, right? A equals A. I would not, you could say, okay, well, what am I gonna do with that? How is that gonna base all mathematics where like my logical positivist dreams are up in flames? Okay, that is fair. But it is trivially true, and no one would deny this, I don't think.
Yeah, no one's going to deny that logical truth. Yeah, they're not going to deny the truthfulness of a
Well,
logical truth
well,
because it's true, right? It's logically true,
so,
and that's
so
the
A
point.
does equal A, right? And that would be an analytic, a very, very basic analytic statement, the form of all of them, as you said.
It's guaranteed to be true, regardless. Um, because it like yeah, there's no way that it can't be true. It's true in all possible worlds. And so, but that's just a logical truth, right? So then that's not really what we're guessing at when we're talking about synonymity in the sense of an analytic statement. Because like you were saying, like when we say that a bachelor is an unmarried man, maybe a child says, "What's a bachelor?" And you say, "Oh, a bachelor is an unmarried man." So we're actually, and then they understand that. So we're actually getting, like you say, we're getting some information out of the out of the activity, right? We're not just saying that a man is a man or an unmarried man is an unmarried man. We're actually getting information out of it. So the sense that statements are just logical truths, people generally want to claim that being analytic is more than just a logical truth. Because if it's just a logical truth, then it's not really saying that much, right? It's just circular. But if we say that it's actually saying more and we're getting new information
Sorry,
from it,
what more would it be saying?
well, like uh, in the example I gave, if the child says, "What's a bachelor?" and you say, "Oh, a bachelor is an unmarried man," and then the child understands, then some knowledge has been gained from that, right?
Yeah, well, they're able to put together the whole domain of knowledge they have about like unmarried men, and then this new information about bachelors, and combine them. They're like, oh, these are synonyms. These are You're not talking about two different things. You're talking about two like the same thing.
Right. So
But that's
that
that's
that's the
logic.
kind of
That's a use of logic. We're not outside the domain of logic there. That's logic.
Y yeah, sure, but I'm saying it's not merely a logical truth. It's not merely a tautology. It's not merely A equals A. It's not A equals A equals A, because we're getting more out of it. We're not saying a bachelor is a bachelor. We're defining it and the child understands. So there's more to it than just a logical
So
truth.
no, no, it is. So so I think there's a mistake you're making here. There's the statement that if I say like our language, honey, when people say this, they mean this, and this is just like what it means in English, right? There is a way in which that's sort of an empirical statement, right? You learn that about the way people use language. It is far shakier than, a straight a priori, where you enter like your mind palace and achieve like pure knowledge through introspection. Like, okay, I would grant you that. But once that has been done, and once that has been assumed, once language L, given language L, it's like once we have agreed that in language L, a bachelor means an unmarried man, then bachelors are unmarried men, right? That should be clear, I think, and is really, is so basic almost as to, be the very basis of our logic, right? That, the law of non-contradiction and the law of identity and the law of the excluded middle are all based around this very issue, right? The law of identity would say that A equals A thing is itself, and it is, the law of contradiction would say that, a thing can't be both itself and not itself at the same time, right? Can't be both, in the same respect, etc., etc. So I would say without these very sort of very basic notions, we don't have much at all, right? In order to sort of even argue for one side or another of any argument about these very issues.
Right. So I'm not rejecting logic or saying that that's not true or that's not useful. I think, um, yeah, the law of identity um, is fine. Like the Aristotelian law of identity is that there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that there's something wrong with that. All I'm saying is that if it's bottoming out as you're just saying analytic means something like A equals A at the end of the day, once you've sort of worked out what the statement means, it just means A equals A, then it's circular. And analytic can only be defined um, in respect to itself. So if that is the case, then we're just going to be saying ufk means ufk, and there's no sort of there's nothing more to it, and that's not what people normally think in the sense
Right,
of analytic
but that
statements that people
seems
want.
but that seems wrong, right? Because you could have a a theoretical breakdown of what motion is, or what any physical activity is, an elaborate definition of it. But then you could also say very simply that motion is motion, or um, that a bachelor is an unmarried man. Something incredibly definitional, like movement, like motion means movement from one place to another, something like that. Incredibly definitional to the very thing itself. So that you could have long elaborations given, scientifically, given empirically, given in other modes of argumentation, but simply to say that because it's sort of circular that it's not true, I think is wrong. I think because it is circular, it is perhaps trivially true, perhaps useless for us, but true. So this goes back to Parmenides, the ancient Greek philosopher, who said, there are two paths, that being is and that being is not. Being is, right? Because being is. And, obviously Parmenides, in the end, that was really the only statement you could make that got us into some trouble. But I think the fundamental insight here, that being is, non-being is not. That these things, these are perhaps tautologies, perhaps meaningless, but they do perhaps even serve as sort of anchor point for our philosophies. That when you ask God what He is, what His essence is, He just says, "I am that I am." But that again is sort of a tautology or an analytic truth. It's
Yeah.
not reassuring. You can't build like a mathematics or a science off of it, but it is still it's still true. Very
Yeah,
true.
yeah. Well, Parmenides was a gangster of the ancient times. I really like that, dude. But I feel like there's a meaningful difference between saying motion is motion and bachelors are unmarried men. Because in one case, the child says, Daddy, what does motion mean? And you say, motion means motion. And he's at loss to experience the meaning of the word motion because he just doesn't, you haven't provided any new information. Whereas if he says, what's a bachelor? And you say, oh, a bachelor's an unmarried man. Um, and it's like, oh, I get it now, right? So in one case, there's no communication of mental concept, or at least communication of something that the child can use to link a concept to the word. But in the
Right.
other case,
So
it's
I
the
would
opposite.
agree. Right. So I would agree. I think that simple tautology is only one type of analytic truth. That there are other truths where A equals, it's not A equals A, but it's like such that like bachelors are men or that bachelors are unmarried, where there are certain concepts which lie within bachelor. And likewise, you could understand the word unmarried and man through perhaps the concept of bachelors. Like if you didn't know about that. Anyway, so we've talked a lot about this notion of analyticity, and we can stay here. I think I do want to say sort of just something about the notions broadly. Um, within the Kantian tradition, I guess I would say that there are really these two faculties. There is the analytic faculty, the understanding, which is going to sort of break things down. Is going to examine them piece by piece, and is a critical faculty, and sort of the one he dominantly employs throughout his critiques. And then there is reason, this synthetic faculty, which is going to see how things are tied together, how various concepts are related to one another and can be combined in new ways. And yeah, there really are these sort of two faculties. So I think analytic and synthetic, in the way we've been talking about them, um, sort of a very elaborated way. I think they have their roots in this earlier notion, in these sort of two faculties. One that is looking into a sentence, trying to take out, oh, I learned from the word bachelor that all bachelors are men, right? And then one that is sort of combining from the outside, um, the sort of the synthetic. And Kant is famous for his idea that there can be a priori synthetic concepts or ideas. So his notion, unlike Frege, so Frege believed when he was talking about mathematics that all math was grounded in analytic statements, that 1 plus 1 equals 2 is an analytic statement about what 2 means in different senses. Whereas Kant believed that when you add 5 to 7 and get 12, the 12 does not exist within the 5 or the 7. The 7 does not exist in the 5. The addition concept is nowhere in any of them. And so you're really you're using your synthetic faculty to bring these numbers together a priori. And I guess that brings us into the a priori, a posteriori distinction. So this distinction, which I think also, is worth defending, makes sense, is this idea that all of our lives and all of our experience is shaped by certain a priori facts. For us to have any experience at all means that it must exist within time and space. We must have a language for us to sort of conceptualize and share our experience of life. There are all sorts of a prioris which sort of shape and are like a lens through which we even have any experience at all. And then there are sort of a posteriori facts that can be generated of experience itself. So I can say ahead of time, right, that a bachelor is an unmarried man, I don't need to depend upon experience. I can simply do that with language alone. If
Right.
I, yeah, and similarly, if I want to say that my wife has 7 toes, I would again depend upon what? I would depend upon experience, right? I would need to, um, that would be a synthetic a posteriori claim. Uh, you'd have to check out my wife's toes, and yeah. So
Right.
I think those distinctions make sense as well to me. Do they not to you?
Right. So there's a bit of a breakdown that I see there as well, right? And I feel like um in this case you've already demonstrated that certain things could be um a priori synthetic, right? So
Sure.
so
Yeah, of
there
course.
we, yeah, we're seeing there that there's some sort of crossing of these divides. So for anyone listening who wasn't familiar with the distinction, so there's the analytic synthetic, the a priori, a posteriori, and the necessary contingent. So it's the analytic synthetic is addressing language, so linguistic terminology. The a priori, a posteriori is epistemological territory, and then the necessary contingent is metaphysical. So we're saying like if something is necessary, for example, A equals A is necessary, or bachelors are married men are um are unmarried men is a necessary um, claim because it just is the case. But something that's contingent is um, it rains a lot in England. And then we look at a priori and a posteriori. A priori, we can seem to think about how can we know um, if something's true. Well, a bachelor being an unmarried man seems to be a priori knowable. So we can know that it's a priori just by thinking, oh, it's an unmarried man. It's in the definition. So we don't need to leave our mind to get to that. Whereas if we want to know whether it rains a lot in England, we sort of have to look and see if it rains a lot in England. So that's a posteriori that it rains a lot in England. And then the same is with the analytic. Bachelors are unmarried men is analytic, but then it's synthetic that it rains a lot in England, right? If that's true or not. And so you've seen that in every single case, I've said the same things on each side of this distinction. So on one side, we've got the analytic a priori necessary, and on the other side, we've got the contingent a posteriori synthetic. But when we start crossing between these categories, we're like doing weird things with the distinction. So the distinction you're starting to see the distinction crumble a tiny bit. It starts to break down a tiny bit there. So if we can have such things as a priori synthetic truths, then it's almost like this distinction seems to be doing something weird at that point. It's almost like it shouldn't hold because if they're opposing types of thought, and in every
Hmm.
case on the
So
left
it
of the
seems like
equation, go ahead.
so right. So it seems like maybe there's a bit of misunderstanding here. So I would agree with your characterization of a priori analytic truths. I guess just in what you said, right? That bachelors are unmarried men. You know that from the definition. We sort of I guess agree on that. It's great. Um, and then your characterization of a posteriori synthetic truths, which are the fact that my wife has 7 toes, right? That would need to be confirmed, and you need to put together various instances of your analysis to do so. Okay. Um, but the fact that there are a priori synthetic truths, I think that is no problem because and the fact that you're saying they should be on either sides of a chart. I mean, you don't need to reference them in terms of a chart, right? There's nothing that connects necessarily the fact that analytic or synthetic, that synthetic must also necessarily be contingent or must necessarily be a posteriori. You could combine together a priori concepts, and that would be a synthetic a priori use of your reason, right? So mathematics, I guess, is the prime example of this. And I think it is a good idea about, like, it's a debate, an open debate in mathematics, whether mathematics is discovered or created, right? Whether we discover it some platonic sense as already existing, or if we actually are just creating mathematics as we go. But this synthetic view is that we in fact create mathematics, that we're building mathematics. It is a human tool that we've made, and anything that we're quote unquote discovering in mathematics, we do so within terms that we have created and set, right? So we have to acknowledge that there are such things as synthetic a prioris that can be necessary, right? So the force with which 2 plus 2 equals 4, or 5 plus 7 equals 12 is necessary, right? But it is not merely analytic in the way that Frege thought. Would you acknowledge this, or would you push back?
Right. Well, I think what you're doing here is agreeing with my thesis, and the thing is that the goalposts for the debate, like what the proposition and its negation are actually arguing for specifically, were a bit hazy. So we talked about this roughly in DMs, and we didn't. We were just like, let's go with the flow and see what happens. And it just seems now that we agree on this point. So if I'm going to start talking about a priori synthetic truths, or I can even talk about Solkripke and rigid designators, and talk about there being contingent a priori truths, or necessary a posteriori truths. And we can go into all of that, and I can go through the whole explanation of how that seemingly implausible state of affairs actually comes to be very plausible indeed. But I think we're just agreeing there. So we don't really need to do all that, because we just agree. So there's no, so if I persuade you of that, you're just going to nod your head and be like, okay, yeah, that's not really interesting to the debate proposition, because guess I guess I defined the debate proposition in a fairly loose way, and we didn't really agree on it 100% what it actually meant. So it was a bit fuzzy. So let's just agree then that the debate proposition in this case, it's only interesting, the goalposts for who wins the debate is really going to be centered around, does the analytic synthetic distinction break down? Because if you're just going to agree with me about all the other ones, like, yeah, contingent a priori and all these things, and you're just going to say, okay, cool, that's fine, I agree, then we're not debating anything, right? So um, let's just focus then. Let's return to the analytic synthetic distinction and see if we can, if I can convince you to concede to my position there, or if
Okay.
not,
Yeah, I mean,
we'll go
I
at
think
it for a bit.
that is
Yeah.
probably reasonable. I think, yeah, I mean, I do want to say some stuff, but no, I think that's fair. I think let us move back to the analytics, because I think that the this notion of analyticity, and really, I guess what I'm saying in that realm is that Quine's critique, I think, is very sweeping. I think it's very powerful, and it does completely freaking demolish Frege and his notion of analyticity, in which
Yeah.
he had this notion of you could just simply replace words with other words that were synonymous, and it would be very helpful in mathematics and physics, so that E equals mc squared is a analytic statement for Frege, right? And I think clearly it takes a little bit of empiricism to tell you that energy is the speed of light, matter times the speed of light squared, or whatever it is. So you do need I think Quine's critique is valid there. There's a certain revisability there, as we discussed with the cats are robots example, right? If cats were robots indeed, then the idea that cats are animals as an analytic truth would just completely break down, right? You would have to revise it, and according to empirical need, right? So that critique is valid, but that leaves just this whole notion of analyticity that really was like what was adopted, since Kant and exists still and is, a valid distinction here from a synthetic truth, which is that, given language L, given a single concept within that language, we can say X based only on that concept, and we don't need recourse to anything outside that concept.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it's going to help to get into extensional and intentional meaning, right? Because this is really going to be a difficult one for holding the position that the analytic synthetic distinction doesn't break down a lot, or it's just not completely circular, right?
Okay,
Because
I would just, can we, so I agree that that would be an interesting conversation. I'd love that. But we've already assumed language L and that this means this language L. So I agree language could, that the, when these analytic uh, distinctions were made, the analytic synthetic distinction was made, even up to Frege, they held, but it's in Kant too, right? They held these notions of concepts, of meaning, of truly, intentional with an S states, right? All these things. And they held them unproblematically. And, you know, perhaps you'd like to challenge them now. And I look forward to that. That would be great. But when they've set them down, they were careful enough to sort of write down their assumptions here. So they were like, well, if language L, and this means this, then we can say that bachelors are unmarried men, which I think is unproblematic, right? Just simply, right? For instance, there need be no intentional state for me to know that, the fact that in Mandarin, that, this symbol creates snow, this song, like, whatever, in French, bonjour means hello, right? I need not speak French to know that, or have, an intentional state to know that. That is simply like a fact about what the results are if in a certain language this means this. And that does get very technical and is like, well, but I think they were careful enough when they wrote this down to make their assumptions at least known. Now, if you want to attack what those assumptions are, if you want to say like, this if statement is not true, that's fine. But if the if statement is true, then the statement as a whole is still true, right? We thank Cool Dog for our knowledge, our lesson in basic logic there.
right, well, I feel like what you're doing in part is going back to um, something which I've already critiqued, like the list theory. So if you're saying, oh, it's intuitively the case that analytic just means this and synthetic just means that, and then we just make a long list of what is synthetic and what is analytic, and then there's the list. What
Oh
is
no,
there
I
more to
wasn't.
say?
Well, no, I wasn't saying that at all. Right? I didn't introduce list theory. You did.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that you was speaking of lists, but that's sort of implied by what you're saying, right? You're sort of implying that it was intuitively the case. We just sort of intuitively
Oh,
understand
okay.
these
So
categories.
so when I set it up, when I set up the debate, what I was trying to aim to do was just like, get the categories on the table. And I do believe they exist intuitively for people. Like I think that you don't need like a long history in education and philosophy to, see the difference between a statement like my wife has 7 toes and bachelors are unmarried men, right? Um, so, but I don't think that we can simply stop there. I think that these are, careful notions, and that we can um, give careful definition. So if we want to do the Kantian definition, I had that, but my phone is like terrible. But basically, he's saying that given a certain concept, we do not need recourse to anything outside of that concept to make a given statement. Right? Now, you could attack the term concept, that's fine, but it does get sort of clarified a little bit further that, like, given a certain language, that this means this in this language, then, we can make this statement.
Yeah, well, the problem with the Kantian definition is I'm just going to attack it from more of a radical empiricist perspective, right? But I feel like, yeah, I just want to sort of get off the table this sense of, but it's intuitive. Either we have a definition for it and then we can attack the definition, or we don't have a definition for it and we're just going to say,
No,
well,
no,
analytic
I
just
gave you the
means
definition.
something intuitive and I don't really know what it means, and we just
No,
make a list of
it means,
terms.
so the definition is that given language L, and that X term means whatever it means in language L, then we can say a statement based not on anything else, but only upon the meaning that it has within language L.
Right. So what you're doing there is, if you're going to say no, it's not intuitive, we've actually got a definition on the table now, then we can attack that definition and let's see where that goes. So if you're saying the Kantian definition, then we can just say that we can't possibly have an idea of a concept in of itself without experience of the world, because how do I know what a bachelor is? Or it's an unmarried man. Or how do I know what an unmarried man is? Well, I need to know from the world. So what you're doing in this sense is you're cornering off a part of your empirical um, the empirical observation of the world, or you're cornering off a bit of your perception and saying, no, this bit of perception isn't empirical. This bit of perception is actually like
No.
a special bit, and that's a priori, or that is analytic, right? There's this special bit over here which is
So,
protected,
so in
right?
a Kantian
But
sense, so in a Kantian sense, we can have something that is not true about, not a statement about noumenal reality in any way, but simply a statement about all possible experience.
yeah, we don't have
So,
to talk about the noumenal at all.
right. So I'm just talking about all possible experience,
Yeah.
and
Like all
phenomenal.
possible perception. Like in the we just need to stick to the phenomenal world. We can just ignore the noumenal world, right, entirely.
Yeah, we don't need to talk about the noumenal world in any way.
Right. So if you're just gonna like corner off a bit of your uh perception of the world and your understanding and everything which is empirical, and say, no, 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 this bit of my perception or this bit of my understanding of the world, this isn't anything to do with empiricism. This is analytic. Well, then you've just kicked the can down the road,
No,
because
but
now you're just going to have to
so
define to me what is analytic.
okay, and I was about to say what is, you have to define what empiricism is. So I have defined analytic. I gave you a definition for it a couple of times, right? Hopefully you can remember.
Right,
Can you
yeah.
define empiricism?
Empiricism. Well, I'm just going to say, like, all of my observation and everything that comes from my observation of the world, all of my everything that is coming through in my perceptions, right, of the world, and
Okay,
it,
so
and
so
included in that are, yeah, included in that are bachelors and unmarried men, and all of these concepts, right? So
okay,
because that is
okay.
all empirical,
Why- So are you saying it's based on your experience? Is that what you're saying?
uh, it's like everything that I'm perceiving through the world is my experience, right? And to have no
Well, you're
perception of the
saying it's
world,
based on your experience, right? You're saying when you say empirical, is that a way of saying like it's based on your experience?
Sure, it's like my experience of the world. Yeah, but what I'm arguing
Okay.
is that if there
Okay,
was
but my
no
point,
experience of
can
the
I
world,
just go for a bit? Yeah,
I
okay,
guess
you go
I
ahead.
had a point to give, but okay, go on.
Okay, sorry. So in order to have an experience of the world, you would need a priori concepts, right? You cannot actually have an experience of the world without certain concepts to apply to that experience. Without concepts, intuition to us would just like sensuous intuition would just be a stream of, uninterpreted data, right? Of undifferentiated nothing, right?
Right,
Or everything, multivariance. You need
we
a
require
priori concepts.
an intuition, which is just our perspective on the world, but we don't. But as part of our intuition, if you're just going to call that a priori, then I'm fine with saying that just our basic states of cognition, our intuition, the way that we perceive in the world, yeah, that's fine. But if you're going to say that included among that category is that bachelors are unmarried men, then there's a problem because it seems that that isn't in that category of my intuition. It's not part of my
Right.
intuition
So
that
this
bachelors are
this comes
unmarried men.
down to so this comes down to the way, I guess, language shapes what we perceive, right? And there are various examples of this, but I think there are examples of tribes that don't understand mathematics because in their language there's no way to distinguish between discrete amounts of money. They can only say like more than, less than, lot, a little bit. And so they're constantly getting ripped off by other tribes. There are different ways that color is seen and perceived in different cultures, and the various ways that being able to distinguish those differences can give you an advantage in things like hunting, or like if you're talking about an Inuit people, the way they're able to distinguish however many types of snow they have, like the 27 or 57 or however many types of snow, right? That type of awareness and linguistic uh, concept is really is a priori to experience, right? Is what gives shape to experience. So you couldn't have your experience without some kind of framework like that. It would just be like colors and shapes. But you couldn't even say that because those are both the most basic qualities.
Right, I'm granting that there is intuition, right? But I'm just not going to grant that in that category of just your basic cognitive functions, you've somehow got bachelors are unmarried men in there as well. It just seems like a category mistake, right? To apply that same level of
Right.
thinking.
So you
So,
don't think that your conception of reality is mediated by language? Oh, I
uh,
wish I had this. You know that TikTok thing where it's like, it plays some weird noise of like swooshing, and then, if you look at the right side of the screen, it has like a word that you hear it say, and then if you look at the left side of the screen, it has a word and you hear it say, but it's like the same swooshing, and it's all about how your brain is psychologically primed, by reading the word to then hear the sound.
I've not seen that, but I can imagine that some sort of illusion leads to unintuitive consequences of the experience. But I feel like
But no, it's not
what
simply an illusion. It's a description where like a psychological priming, or this notion of what we expect to see is directly influencing what we perceive at a like the most direct psychological level, right? You do hear, like I did it, I looked at it. You do literally hear like the one statement if you look at the one word, and you hear the other statement if you look at the other phrase, right?
I feel
So
like this
so
is
what I'm
all.
saying is, so
Yeah,
language has an incredibly is an a priori, right? Language is one of our a prioris. I agree that no one is born with language. It's something we develop and grow into, and it is all messy, and like a behaviorist account of language, especially like Wittgenstein or Quine give, is going to make notions like meaning or concept, very tricky to hold, right? Okay, I grant that. But given all of that, given language and its precariousness, that we are in language, that we do speak English, that bachelor means an unmarried man, we can say that bachelors are unmarried men.
Right. Yeah, I feel like you said a few really interesting things, but they were slightly tangential to your final conclusion, which is that bachelors are unmarried men. And I agree that bachelors are unmarried men. The the question on the table though is whether we can define analytic propositions um, in some meaningful way or whether it's circular. And I think what you're ultimately saying is yeah, well, I don't care if it's circular, but that would
Right.
seem to be uh, losing the debate, right? Because my
No, because
idea,
all statements about anything are ultimately circular within the game of language, right? All the definition that I can give you for any word is merely going to be another set of words, which then have their own definitions as another set of words, and on and on and on, right? So to say that, my definition here is circular would be like uniquely circular, I think is false, right? If it is true of everything, then it is just trivially true, and therefore, we don't need to. Your attack on me would be unwarranted, right? Or not on me, but on like this notion of analyticity, right? So, if like there is no problem with it being in some sense circular as long as it is valuable in that knowing different synonyms for things is good. If it's valuable as in knowing what is implied by certain things, like if I don't know, if you go by a sign for a bar and it's like bachelors only night or something, this is a very strange bar, then, or maybe it's like bachelorette only night, right? Then knowing that like you as like a man should not, like you are like a male bachelor, you should not go to that bar, right? Because you're not a bachelorette. That's probably like that will actually do you well in life, right? That is like, your presence is not wanted there, right? Maybe it is because they're bachelorettes, but who knows? It's bachelorettes only. Is my
right?
would be my
So I agree that it could be useful, right? But that's again not really what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is that it's circular in a way which is problematic to the distinction, right? So you said okay, well everything's circular, so this is just going to be a general problem with linguistics and not just for the distinction. Even if it's fatal to the distinction, then it's going to be fatal to all of linguistics, and it's going to be the problem's not going to be applied specifically here. It's going to be a more general problem. But I would just
well,
say
and
that it's
then
very
would apply
easy to
equally
argue
to your
against that.
own. No,
But
no, but it
I
would
would say that
that would
it's
equally apply to your own critique of me, right? If that were
well,
true, then
no, because
anything you
I
say
can
is just infinitely circular, right?
well I can argue against all of this very easily. Like
Okay.
we can just quote Wittgenstein. Meaning is use, right? And then we've just got around all of these problems. And we don't have to have this analytic synthetic distinction, and it ceases to be meaningful. We can't define it, it's circular. And I feel like what's happened in
No,
this
but
debate is we've agreed a lot, but you've agreed more to my side of things to the point where I just think you're sort of conceding that the distinction does fall apart. And if we
no,
can just have meaning
no,
being used, like Wittgenstein um,
no.
tells us, shows us,
So
then it's fine.
I no, but it's interesting you're moving for concession because you've actually agreed with me that bachelors are unmarried men and that that's an analytic statement that exists we can make meaningfully, right? So, I would say that meaning being use is just simply not any problem in like however you want to define meaning, given language L, that this word has that meaning, and we can say such and such about it without referring to any other concepts outside of that single one.
Well, in terms of me conceding your position, I don't agree because all we've agreed upon is that it's either circular or you can't even define it, in which case it's circular. So in the sense that we're saying that it could somehow be useful is just that we're making an intuitive list of what is analytic and what is synthetic, and then the second I come along and say, oh well, why is that analytic and why is that synthetic? You can't tell me because you've got no definition of it. You can't define it. It's because the only
No.
definition you
Well,
can
I
give is
have.
circular.
So you are roboting a bit. Am I roboting, or are you roboting?
I th- I've got a feeling you're roboting more than me because you cut out for me as well, but I don't know honestly. But
It's
yeah,
hard to tell.
the only thing you can do is offer me either a circular definition or no real definition at all, and I feel like
What? No, no.
yeah,
Okay,
right.
so
So
you are now equivocating between two different things. You're saying
what?
that
Where's the
analytic
equivocation?
statements, right? So you're saying that analytic statements are circular, which in a way, some of them kind of are, okay, but they're still useful and they still are true despite their circularity in that way. But then you're saying that my definition of analyticity is circular, which it absolutely is not.
No, I'm saying you can't define analyticity unless you are using a circular argument or circular reasoning to define it, right? So, and in the case of
No,
the
because I've just defined it like multiple times as given a certain language, then and the meaning of a word in that language, we can make an analytic statement if we only rely on the meaning of that one word in this one language and not other words in other languages or other words in that language or anything else outside of that one word.
right, so you're just saying A in language L means A, so you're just
We
providing a
can make a
circular account.
statement, so we can make that's what an analytic statement is. Yes.
Yeah, well then it's circular, right? So your definition is circular.
No, my definition is quite plain. What I'm describing is an analytic statement, which is in some sense circular because it is based on its own definition. You're making a statement, but it's still both useful and true,
Well, I can
despite
just
its kind of obvious
I
a
can give
bit
you
circularity.
circumstances where an analytic statement is not necessarily true, just depending on the way you look at it. So, for example, um, if we say, uh, if Clark Kent kisses Lois Lane, then Lois Lane also kisses Superman, right? That's either going to be true or false because if you know that Superman is Clark Kent, then it's true. But if you don't know that Clark Kent is Superman, then Clark Kent kissing Lois Lane doesn't mean that Lois Lane also kisses Superman. So then it's false because it's just then we're just thinking about like epistemic connections, right?
Okay,
Relationships at that point,
so
and
I
then it
agree
starts to break
that
down again.
analytic statements. Okay, so what you're doing is actually making uh, I would say a common error when you're talking about this, which is that you're thinking that I'm trying to make a statement about what is ontologically the case, true in reality itself, which I've never made, right?
No, not
First of
necessarily.
all, first of all, I
I'm
can't
just
speak
giving
about the
you
noumena, right?
no, no, no.
So
I'm
first of
just
all,
giving you.
no, no, can I go
I'm
through?
just give,
Can I go?
dude. Let me talk. Please. I'm just giving you
Okay.
two different conceptions of looking at the proposition. We can either have an extension of meaning or an intention of meaning, right? So if it's an intentional meaning of looking at that proposition, then we would say that it's false that Clark Kent kissing Lois Lane means that Lois Lane also kisses Superman. But if we look at that statement with an extensional meaning, meaning that the meaning of Clark Kent extends to the object itself, which is also Superman, then we know that if Clark Kent kisses Lois Lane, then Lois Lane also kisses Superman. We know that's true, right? So it depends on whether you've got an intentional or extensional sense of the meaning of the proposition there. So in that sense,
Yeah.
the value of the proposition changes based upon your conceptualization of what is meant by analysis, analytic in this context. So so then we need to
So,
define what
so I would
actually is analytic.
right. So that was very interesting, very cool. I like that a lot. But um, no, no. Um, so if you have an analytic statement, right, such as Clark Kent is Superman, right? Something like that. That is the analytic statement of the kind that cats are robots, right? Okay, this is a bad example because like Superman has no mask, so I have no idea why people can't distinguish them. But like, so let's move to like a Batman that has a mask. We can say it's like the same thing. So like, if we say that Batman is Bruce Wayne, that would be something that um, is the case that cats are animals, right? We could say that, right? But it would have to be revised in the case of us discovering, under the mask that, oh, Batman was actually um, J. Jonah Jameson from another comic, um, right? Uh, we would have to revise our statement, right? So this is an attack on the wrong type of analyticity. So first of all, right, it doesn't attack the notion that all bachelors are unmarried men. Secondly, I think in the case of these two different sets of populations, one that know and one that don't know the identity of Superman, we could simply say that they use these terms differently. The definition of Clark Kent does not include the information, oh, he is Superman also, right? This is the secret identity of Superman. You have a case where language is just being used in different ways. We can say that population one has one language, language A, population two has language B, right? Given language A, this is true. Given language B, that is true. That would just be fine within at least my very, weak definition of analyticity, but one that would hold for cases like bachelors um, being unmarried men, and would hold in other cases of synonymity, like things being synonymous. Yeah, and
Right.
and
So
also one that is held also by most analytic philosophers themselves, right? Even following Frege, like all of their weird, mathematical squiggles all begin with like assuming language L.
right, but I've not got a problem with assuming language L. It feels like this is just some separate critique which doesn't really address what I'm saying, right? Because like this was such a damaging death blow. Quine's um,
to to Frege,
essay.
to Frege, but
Yeah,
Frege,
yeah, to Frege, but also logical positivism in general was just like completely annihilated from this withered logical positivism, because like the sense of analytic which they were um, re- relying on is just so fatal that it withered the entire movement, right? So I don't know how you can just say, oh well, other philosophers have relied on it before or something like this, and so um, yeah, it seemed to work for them or something. Like when I point out the specific objections to it, I don't feel like we're making progress on like combating those rejections. I feel like maybe we should wrap up the conversation um, soon though, because we've been going for a while and I don't have much more to say other than we're sort of agreeing that the whole project of analytic versus synthetic is the definition is just circular, and the definition is almost elusive because I can put counterexamples in like the Lois Lane one, where the proposition would just be false based upon an intentional understanding of it, and rather than it being true. But then you're just going to have to say, oh, that's going to be a different language. But then if the statement's false and it's not analytic to begin with, right? So then that's a problem. And if it's true and we're using an extensional sense, and we're just back to being circular. So either it's circular or it doesn't work. And if it's defined circularly to itself, then that's not really a good definition. We can't just define things as themselves because that's not really defining it. Really, it's just saying that A is A. So I don't feel like we can go anywhere from here. I feel like you agree with me for the most part, but you just somehow don't think it's problematic. And I'm saying, oh well, it really is problematic, but you just think, oh, well, we can use it intuitively and it's useful. And I don't agree that it's useful if we can't define it, and it doesn't seem to make much sense, right? So I know what you mean when you think that it's intuitive that a bachelor is an unmarried man, being analytic, but it just doesn't hold that we have any way to define it other than being completely circular, right? And so I guess that could even just be my closing statement then. And if you want to go, we can put it to a vote after that, unless you I'm going to take it you're not going to concede to the debate proposition,
Oh,
although I feel like it sort of
oh my,
is a concession to my view in a way, but you just don't think that really
no,
loses you the
no, it is.
debate in a way.
No, no, it's clearly not a concession, right? Sorry, I was going for a while, but I guess I got disconnected. Um, anyway, what I was saying was that just because Quine has critiqued this view of analyticity doesn't mean we now have to throw out the distinction between analytic and synthetic. When something is critiqued in philosophy, it's often sharpened, right? We now have a sharper and better tool for determining different types of statements. We realize that, the dreams of the logical positivists were, not everything they were cracked up to be, that we couldn't ground all mathematics in logic, and then all physics in mathematics, and then all chemistry in physics, and biology and chemistry, and all the way up, right? That was a dream that failed, right, in a large way. But because of that failure and the critiques of the logical empiricists, it does not mean that we throw out the whole notion of analyticity and this distinction with the synthetic, right? These are valuable notions with a whole history in philosophy that exists long before Frege's expanded use of them. And these original intuitive distinctions I introduced at the beginning, these just remain entirely intact due to Quine's critique. These things are not debated by you. You have conceded, in fact, to me, that we can say that bachelors are unmarried men, and that is an unproblematic analytic statement. There are certain types of statements, such as, animals or cats are animals, right? Which would be the result, or would need to be revised empirically. But the type of bachelor statement, this statement where what we mean by bachelor is an unmarried man, remains, an entirely justified analytic statement, not of reality itself, not of the noumenal, not of some true reality, but simply of the meaning of the word within our language. So I
Okay,
certainly don't
cool,
think
man.
that's a conception, right? Yeah, but hopefully, yeah, you had fun. I
Well, I
certainly
think I
played
think
too.
you mentioned that the connection cut out a bit. I don't know if you heard that I said that was my closing statement. So I was just saying about how I felt that I think we're we're both thinking that each other conceded to our positions. But yeah, I just highlighted. I feel like the whole project of the distinction is circular, and there's no good definition to be had, despite the fact that it may or may not be intuitive. It doesn't matter because it's not definable.
Hmm.
So I guess
No,
we've
no, no, no. So I would, yeah, fundamentally, you're able to, first of all, I've provided the definition. You can make a statement based only upon the meaning of a single term within a language, no other term or recourse to other concept, just that one term. That's my definition. That's not circular. Okay. The fact that analytic statements are a bit circular is maybe a limitation of them in a critique of their usefulness, but I've shown that they are useful and that they do have meaning, right? That they do provide this way of synthesizing various bodies of knowledge through concepts like synonyms, um, and they are not entirely based in synonymity either. They can be broken down. So I think there are uses here, and they are certainly true. I think things that are circular, like a tautology, for example, you could say that it's circular, but I would say that the fact that A equals A is just simply the law of identity, the basis of any reason and any logic, any conversation we have is going to take that for granted. Yeah, you can't. You would have to invoke this law in order to refute. So yeah, I thank you so much for the debate. Thanks for everyone for listening. This was an arcane one, obscure topic, but yeah, thanks for sticking it out.
Cool,
Appreciate
man. Great stuff. Yeah. So I guess we've both made our closing statements then, and because we don't agree on a concession, I guess we'll put it to a vote. I don't know if Stone Shepherd is